St. Augustine is one of the most influential figures in the ancient world. He is so influential that almost every tradition in the Christian world claims him for their own, especially on the topic of the papacy. Orthodox and Protestants will claim that St. Augustine follows their tradition, that he directly denies the claims that the Catholics make. But is this true? Well, in this examination, we will be proving that St. Augustine saw St. Peter as the head of the universal church, not just for the laymen or those who are not of the sacrament of ordination, but also those who have claimed the role of bishop. For it is true that in the same way the Apostolic College was set up, so the bishops of the church follow the same structure. We will be bringing quotes with explanations, and at the end, examining the words of St. Augustine to St. Innocent. I hope you enjoy. Then he comes to Simon Peter, as if he had come to the chief. Who is ignorant that the first of the apostles is the most blessed Peter? But we are not therefore to understand that he came to him after others, but began from him. Joannes Evangelium 56:84-16. Here we see a clear example of this fact that among the apostles, St. Peter is first, and he gives an example of the Lord approaching him as if he had come to the chief, for he is the first among the 12. He continues to show this fact all over his writings in many ways, and I quote, "Some things are said which seem to relate especially to the Apostle Peter, and yet are not clear in their meaning unless referred to the Church, which he is acknowledged to have represented in a figure, on account of the primacy which he bore among the disciples, such as, 'I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven,' and other similar passages." Within this quote, we see that St. Peter represents the entire church in a figure, and this is explained because of his primacy among the apostles. He continues by describing the same type of formula, and I quote, "Therefore the same Peter, called blessed by the rock, bearing the figure of the church, holding the chief place in the apostleship, shortly after he heard he was blessed, now heard that he was Peter, now heard that he was built upon the rock." Sermon 76. With all of this, we can show that in the mind of St. Augustine, he sees St. Peter as the first among the apostles themselves, that he bears primacy among the disciples, and that he holds the chief place in the apostleship. Now, he goes on to show that the see of Peter actually has a higher dignity than that of other sees. He states, "I suppose there is no slight to Cyprian in comparing him with the apostle Peter in respect of his crown of martyrdom. Rather, I ought to be afraid lest I am slighting Peter. Who can be ignorant that the chief apostolate is to be preferred to any episcopate? But even if the dignity of their seats differ, the glory of martyrdom is one." The argument here is straightforward. Both St. Cyprian and Peter were one and the same when it comes to their manner of giving testimony to Christ by their martyrdom. However, St. Peter was given the chief apostolate, which is the Roman apostolate, and therefore his see is to be superior to all others, even St. Cyprian's of Carthage. This would bring forth how we should understand St. Augustine when he truly gives Peter the first among, the chief place, and the primacy within. For St. Peter is truly given a see, that is to be that chief among his colleagues. Now, how are we to understand St. Augustine when he states that Peter represents the entire church? Is this just some symbolic declaration with no real grounding in reality that is related to his see? Now, I believe we've answered that in part by showing he believes St. Peter's see to be of a higher dignity. But I think St. Augustine directly gives a clear answer to this question within his sermon on the martyrdom of St. Peter. And I quote, "Before his passion, the Lord Jesus, as you know, chose those disciples of his whom he called apostles. Among these, it was only Peter who almost everywhere was given the privilege of representing the whole church. It was in the person of the whole church, which he alone represented, that he was privileged to hear, 'To you will I give the keys of the kingdom of heaven.' After all, it isn't just one man that received these keys, but the church in its unity. So this is the reason for Peter's acknowledged preeminence, that he stood for the church's universality and unity. When he was told, 'To you, Lamb, entrusting what has in fact been entrusted to all,' but that was said to Peter to show you that Peter at that time stood for the universal church. Listen to what is said to him. Sermon 295, Section 2. It seems that this role of representing the entire church was unique to him and only him, for he is the one who spoke for the apostles. When the keys are given to him, they are given to the entire church. But why? Because he is the one in whom the whole church stands. This, in fact, helps us acknowledge his preeminence, and that he stood for the church's universality and unity. What is most interesting is that he identifies the church's authority to its unity. Who is the one in which stands for the church's unity according to St. Augustine? St. Peter the Apostle, the one who is first, chief, holds primacy, has preeminence, and who stands for the universal church. So when one tries to use this as a slam dunk against the truthfulness of the papacy as tied to St. Peter is wrong in their assessment. There truly is weight to these claims, especially if they hold any resemblance to the governance of the Church after the Apostolic Age. And this is where the Bishop of Rome makes his majestic entry. I want to begin with quoting J.N.D. Kelly, British theologian and preacher dealing with the history of Christianity, and is an Anglican clergyman, who affirms that St. Augustine truly does believe that the Roman Pontiff is the one who leads the Church. He states, Augustine regarded St. Peter as the representative or symbol of the unity of the Church and of the Apostolic College, and also as the apostle upon whom the primacy was bestowed. Even so, he was a type of the Church as a whole. This, the Roman Church, the seat of St. Peter, to whom the Lord after his resurrection entrusted the feeding of his sheep, was for him the church in which the primacy of the apostolic chair has always flourished. The three letters, Epistle 175 through 177, relating to Pelagianism, which the African church sent to Innocent I in 416, and of which Augustine was draughtsman, suggested that he attributed to the Pope's pastoral and teaching authority extending over the whole church, and found a basis for it in Scripture. End quote. I quote him not to proclaim that this is the sole reason our position is correct, but to show you that this is not a reading that is foreign to scholars or professionals in this field of study. Therefore, this reading shouldn't be dismissed as a novelty of papistry, as some people like to call our explanations. So, with this, we will continue with St. Augustine and the evidence from his writings. And I quote, "The succession of priests keeps me, beginning from the very seat of the Apostle Peter, to whom the Lord, after his resurrection, gave it in charge to feed his sheep down to the present episcopate." End quote. We see that St. Augustine truly did believe that the seat of Peter was directly given the charge to feed the sheep of the Lord. In another writing, he attributes this same seat to the Roman Pontiff. And I quote, "What has the chair done to you of the Roman Church in which Peter sat and which Anastasius fills today, or the Church of Jerusalem, in which James once sat?" End quote. He continues by proclaiming that this seat of Peter has supremacy and has always held this position. And I quote, "Carthage was also near to the countries beyond the sea, and distinguished by illustrious renown, so that it had a bishop of more than ordinary influence, who could afford to disregard even a number of enemies conspiring against him, because he saw himself united by letters of communion both to the Roman Church, in which the supremacy of an apostolic chair has always flourished, and to all other lands which Africa itself received the gospel, and was prepared to defend himself before these churches if his adversaries attempted to cause an alienation of them from him." Epistle 43.7. St. Augustine even goes so far as to call the succession from the seat of Peter, the Roman Pontiff, the rock that the proud gates of Hades cannot conquer. And I quote, "Why, a faggot or branch that is cut off from the vine retains its shape. But what use is that shape if it is not living from the root? Come, brothers, if you wish to be engrafted in the vine, it is grievous when we see you thus lying cut off. Number the priests even from the seat of Peter. In that order of fathers, see who to whom succeeded, that is, the rock which the proud gates of Hades do not conquer. All who rejoice in peace only judge truly." End quote. There seems to be a true affirmation of the leadership role of the Roman Pontiff, And from this, we can see why he reacts so positively to Pope St. Innocent I when he himself claims his own authority. But before examining this evidence, we will answer the objection from St. Augustine's retractions on the interpretation of Matthew chapter 16. Even though I do not directly believe this relates to the authority of the Roman pontiff in St. Augustine's mind, it is still an objection that must be addressed. Many might point to how St. Augustine understands Matthew 16, not only throughout his work, but also within his retractions, where he directly states that the rock is the confession of Christ rather than Peter himself. But people miss two aspects to this text that St. Augustine admits despite his interpretation within the retractions. First, that there is good cause for one to interpret these words as pointing to Peter himself by ancient witnesses even before his time. And I quote, "In this book I spoke in a certain passage of the Apostle Peter, that on him, just as on a rock, was the church established. The sentiment of this statement is also sung in the mouths of many in the verses of the most blessed Ambrose, in which he says concerning the crowing bird, 'When the bird crowed, the rock of the church washes away his guilt.' Chapter 20, paragraph 2, page 151 through 152. Second, though he admits that he also interprets this in another way, he then goes on to leave it up to the reader on what interpretation works best with the passage. This does not show hostility to this interpretation, it shows humility and difference of opinion. He states, however, the reader may choose which of these two notions is the more plausible. Chapter 20, paragraph 2, page 153. We must also point out that this interpretation has no bearing on the debate itself, for we see that St. Augustine still saw the primacy of Rome to be derived from other scriptural passages and rulings. And I quote, "The succession of priests keeps me, beginning from the very seat of the Apostle Peter, to whom the Lord, after his resurrection, gave it in charge to feed his sheep, down to the present episcopate." End quote. Clearly we see St. Augustine directly understood Rome as head and ruler of the whole church. Now that we have dealt with this objection, we will move to the Pelagian heresy and St. Augustine's affirmation of papal authority. Surrounding the Pelagian heresy in the time of St. Augustine, there were two councils that were brought forth, the Council of Carthage and the Council of Mileve, both of which brought letters to the Roman Church in order to get his judgment on the matter. A Protestant author, E. Giles, in his work Documents Illustrating Papal Authority, summarized these two letters to the Pope. These documents truly do assign and proclaim the authority of the Roman Pontiff. E. Giles summarizes the Council of Carthage's letter as thus: "The 69 bishops are clear that their former condemnation of Celestius was correct. But since he and Pelagius have been acquitted in the East, they must be made to renounce their errors openly. Otherwise, it will appear that the heresy itself is approved. They urge the Pope to support them in this, because of his wide authority. Their own preaching based on Paul is ineffectual. The Pope, having before him the acts of the Synod, which acquitted Pelagius and Celestius, will be in a better position to decide whether they were rightly acquitted. At all events, the heresy itself must be overthrown." Page 197, and is listed as document 176 within his book. He summarizes the Council of Mileve's letter as thus: "This letter comes from 61 bishops, including Augustine. It gives less information than the one from Carthage, but presses the same point, that the Pope must condemn the heresy to prevent its spreading. It hints that the Palestine Council was deceived by Pelagius. The heretics will more readily yield to the Pope, but why? Because his authority is drawn from the authority of the Bible. Chapman says there must be more in it than that. If the authority of the Pope and that of the episcopate are both drawn from the same source, why should one have more weight than the other? He is sure the passage means that papal authority is based on the primacy of Peter as revealed in the Bible. He finds this to be the contemporary African view by combining the following passages from Augustine. Who is ignorant that the first of the apostles is the most blessed Peter? Who can be ignorant that the chief apostolate is to be preferred to any episcopate? The Roman Church, in which the primacy of the apostolic chair has always flourished. It was of the utmost importance to secure papal condemnation of the heresy, and so the letters of the two councils are supported by a long private letter to the Pope from 5 leading African bishops, page 198 through 199, document 177. There is something very great about this, for these letters do not treat the authority of Rome as a passing ecclesial tradition decided by some council, but is directly connected with divine revelation. This is also affirmed by the Pope himself in the letter he sends to the councils, and I quote, "In inquiring about those things which should be handled with all care by priests, and especially by a true, just, and Catholic council, by preserving, as you have done, the example of ancient tradition, and by being mindful of the discipline of the Church, you have truly strengthened the vigor of our religion, no less in consulting than before in passing sentence. For you decided that it was proper to refer to our judgment, knowing what is due to the Apostolic See, since all we who are set in this place desire to follow the very apostle from whom the very episcopate and whole authority of this name has emerged, following whom we know how to condemn the evil and to approve the good. So also you have by your priestly office preserved the institutions of the fathers, and have not spurned that which they decreed by a sentence, not human, but divine, that whatever is done, even though it be in a distant province, should not be ended until it comes to the knowledge of the See, that by its authority the whole just pronouncement should be strengthened, and that from there the other churches, like waters proceeding from their natal sources and flowing through the different region of the world, the pure streams of an uncorrupt head, should take up what they ought to enjoin, whom they ought to wash, and whom that water, worthy of pure bodies, should avoid as defiled with uncleanable filth. I congratulate you, therefore, dearest brothers, that you have directed a letter to us by our brother and fellow bishop Julius, and that while caring for the churches which you rule, you also show your concern for the advantage of all, that you ask for a decision which may benefit all the churches of the world." End quote. Here we do not see someone that is low in his mindset on the authority of the Roman pontiff. St. Pope Innocent clearly articulates that the councils are preserving the example of ancient tradition by deciding to refer to our judgment, knowing what is due to the Apostolic See, since all we who are set in this place desire to follow the very apostle from whom the very episcopate and whole authority of this name has emerged. This section is, of course, referring to St. Peter himself, which vindicates Chapman's reading of the Council of Carthage, that they believe his authority be drawn from what is pronounced about and conferred to St. Peter himself. He then continues and affirms that the divine law demands that whatever is done, even though it be in distant provinces, should not be ended until it comes to the knowledge of the See, that by its authority the whole just pronouncement should be strengthened, and that from there the other churches. He then affirms the source analogy from his judgment on the matter. Every single church may be uplifted, just as, like waters proceeding from their natal sources and flowing through the different regions of the world, the pure streams of an uncorrupt head. This directly affirms the idea that the Roman pontiff is a source that brings fruit to all the other apostolic churches. For him, it is like the source that benefits the waters. He reaffirms my conclusion when he states that the actions of the Council of Carthage appealing to him will bring about benefit to all the churches of the world. I use this quote from St. Bellarmine a lot, because I believe that this quote truly does explain this position the best, when he states, "The episcopate is one in the same manner in which the church is one. Furthermore, the church is one in the same manner in which many branches of a tree are one tree, many rivers one water, many rays one light." And in the same place, Cyprian says that there is unity, just as in the branches, rivers, and rays, by reason of the one head, that is, of the root, font, and the sun. Even though the branches, rivers, and rays are multiplied, so also the church is one, and the episcopate one in the root and head, although there are many particular churches and many particular episcopates. Therefore, part of one great episcopate is held by individual bishops in solidity, but not equally, nor in the same way. For Peter and his successors hold that part which is just as the head and the root and the source. The rest hold the other parts, which are like the branches and the rivers. This one episcopate, as we said, similar to a heterogeneous body, not a homogeneous body, from which it follows that individual bishops do not hold part of this episcopate in the same way. For just as the root, although it is apart as the branches, is also, nevertheless, holds up and rules the branches, as well as everything which is in the branches. They are virtually in the root, not the other way around. So also, although the Roman Church and the Roman Episcopate are part of the universal Church, and the universal episcopate, just like the Church of Tusculum has its episcopate, nevertheless the Roman Church rules Tusculum, not the other way around. Therefore, from the teaching of Cyprian, it is rightly gathered that the Roman Pope is not only the bishop of all churches, as there are indeed other true bishops who receive their part of the universal Church to rule. Nevertheless, it is not rightly gathered that the Roman Pontiff is not the head and pastor of all bishops, and hence also the universal Church, seeing that the part which has been consigned to them to rule has that place in the Church, which has the root in the tree, the head in the body, and the font in the rivers of water. Now that we understand the Roman Catholic claim and what St. Innocent proclaims of himself, we shall continue to St. Augustine. For in his reviews of these letters the Pope sent, he does not condemn them as an innovation, but as what is rightly said of the Apostolic See. Not only this, but from his review, he reaffirms the Pope's decision and believes the controversy is finished because of this fact. And I quote, "Reports from 2 councils in Carthage and Maleves were sent to the Apostolic See, therefore before the ecclesiastical proceedings at which Pelagius was said to have been acquitted in the presence of some bishops. We also wrote to Pope Innocent of blessed memory a personal letter in addition to the reports of the councils, in which we dealt with this issue somewhat more at length. He replied to us on all these points in the way in which it was right and necessary for the bishop of the Apostolic See. Where you find such things, do not hide them. May it not be a perverse mercy in you, by all means, if you find such things, do not hide them. Refute the contradictors, and lead the resistant ones to us. For now, about this case, 2 councils were sent to the Apostolic See. Hence also responses came. The case is finished, if only the error were at some point finished." End quote. From the evidence presented, it becomes difficult to reduce St. Augustine's understanding of Peter and Rome to a merely symbolic or honorary primacy. Throughout his writings, Augustine consistently describes St. Peter as the first of the apostles, the one holding the chief place in the apostleship, bearing primacy among the disciples, and representing the unity and universality of the whole Church. These titles are not isolated rhetorical flourishes, but form a consistent pattern in his ecclesiology. Likewise, St. Augustine does not separate Peter from the Roman See. The seat of Peter is identified directly with the Church of Rome and its bishops, whom Augustine sees as inheriting the apostolic charge given to Peter to feed my sheep. He explicitly speaks of the Roman Church as a place in which the supremacy of an apostolic chair has always flourished, and appeals to the succession of Peter's chair as a visible mark of the true Church against schismatics and heretics. This understanding becomes even clearer during the Pelagian controversy. Augustine and the African bishops treated Rome as the Apostolic See, whose judgment carried universal significance. Their appeals to Pope Innocent I rested on the belief that the authority of the Roman See was rooted in divine institution and apostolic succession. Innocent himself responded in precisely these terms, grounding his authority in the office that descends from Peter, and Augustine received these claims positively, rather than as an innovation or exaggeration. Even Augustine's later comments in the retractions concerning Matthew 16 do not overturn this broader framework. Whether the rock is understood as Peter personally or Peter's confession, Augustine still maintains Peter's primacy, the preeminence of the Roman See, and the authority of the apostolic chair throughout his corpus. The debate over the interpretation of Matthew 16 therefore does not erase the larger reality of Augustine's ecclesiology. In the end, St. Augustine presents a vision of the Church in which unity is visibly centered upon Peter and continues through the Roman See. We see that the essential principles of Petrine primacy, Roman preeminence, apostolic succession, and universal pastoral authority are undeniable and present within his corpus.